My parents never hid who they loved more. They just expected me to pretend it didn't hurt. While my sister was praised for breathing, I was criticized for existing too quietly. Every family dinner felt like a reminder of my place, useful when needed, invisible when not. I told myself it was normal, that love just looked different for different kids. But the truth was sharper than that. I wasn't unloved by accident. I was overlooked by choice. And the night I left that letter behind, I made sure no one could ignore me ever again. I learned early how to stay small. Not physically, but emotionally. In our house, space belonged to my sister first, her voice, her needs, her emotions. If she cried, my parents rushed. If I did, they told me to toughen up. When she forgot homework, it was a mistake. When I forgot, it was a character flaw. I became an expert at watching patterns, at predicting reactions before they happened. Birthdays were the clearest example. Her parties were planned months in advance, themed, loud, and overflowing with guests. Mine were quiet dinners where my mom checked her phone and my dad reminded me how expensive cake had gotten. If I ever pointed out the difference, I was called dramatic. "You're older," they'd say. "You understand." What they really meant was that I wasn't worth the effort. At school, I worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Straight A's earned me a nod. My sister's average grades earned a celebration. Teachers praised my discipline, my parents called it expectation. I stopped bringing report cards home with pride and started bringing them home with silence. Family vacations followed the same rule. My sister chose destinations. My sister chose activities. If I wanted something different, I was ruining the mood. So I learned to say I'm fine even when I wasn't. Especially when I wasn't. The worst part wasn't the favoritism itself, it was the way my parents denied it. Gaslighting wrapped in smiles. "We love you both the same," my mother insisted, right after buying my sister a new phone and telling me mine still worked. My father said I was imagining things, that I was too sensitive. Sensitivity became my sin. By the time I was 16, I stopped expecting fairness. I told myself independence was a strength. That not needing anyone made me better. But deep down, I still wanted one moment where someone chose me first. I just didn't know yet how far I'd have to go to get it. My sister knew exactly how protected she was. She wore it like armor. Rules bent around her, consequences dissolved in her presence, and apologies were always optional. If she took something of mine, I was told to share. If I took something of hers, I was accused of jealousy. Over time, she stopped pretending to be kind. She didn't need to. She borrowed money she never repaid. Clothes she never returned. Opportunities she never earned. And every time I pushed back, my parents intervened, not to mediate but to silence me. "Don't start drama," my mother would warn. My sister would smirk, already victorious. When she failed out of her first college program, my parents blamed stress. When I chose a practical major instead of my dream, they called it sensible. They invested in her second chance and called my sacrifice maturity. I started to realize that in this family, responsibility wasn't rewarded, it was exploited. She learned how to cry on command. How to twist stories just enough to make herself the victim. If we argued, she'd run to our parents, rewriting the scene before I even opened my mouth. By the time I tried to explain, the verdict was already decided. I was always guilty of something: tone, timing, attitude. The entitlement grew louder as we got older. She expected help, praise, forgiveness. I was expected to provide all three without complaint. When she moved back home after another failed relationship, my parents gave her my old room without asking. They told me to understand, she needed stability. Apparently, I didn't. I watched her take and take, convinced the world owed her comfort. And my parents stood behind her every step, reinforcing the lie that she could do no wrong. I wasn't angry yet. I was exhausted. There's a difference. What finally changed was realizing she didn't just benefit from favoritism, she relied on it. And the moment it disappeared, she would have nothing to stand on. By my early 20s, I understood my role perfectly. I wasn't the favorite. I wasn't the rebel either. I was the stabilizer, the one expected to absorb tension so the family could pretend everything was fine. When something went wrong, eyes turned to me first. If my sister snapped, I must have provoked her. If she failed, I must have distracted her. Accountability skipped her entirely and landed squarely on me. I learned to apologize for things I didn't do because it kept the peace. I learned that silence was safer than truth. Every disagreement followed the same script. My sister escalated emotionally. My parents defended her intensity as passion. My calm responses were labeled cold, dismissive, or cruel. Somehow, restraint was worse than chaos. The more I succeeded outside the family, the smaller they treated me inside it. When I landed a stable job, my parents bragged to relatives, but never to me. When my sister drifted between plans, they rallied around her dreams, funding them, praising her potential. My accomplishments were treated like expectations fulfilled, not milestones reached. I started spending less time at home. Distance became my survival strategy. But guilt followed me everywhere. My parents mastered the art of disappointment disguised as concern. "You've changed," my mother would say. "You're never around anymore." She never asked why. She never had to. In her version of events, my absence was a betrayal, not a boundary. Family gatherings were the worst. Old dynamics resurfaced instantly. My sister dominated conversations, exaggerating stories, rewriting history. When I corrected her, even gently, my father shot me warning looks. "Let it go. Don't embarrass her. Don't embarrass us." My comfort was always negotiable. Their image wasn't. I tried therapy once. I stopped after 3 sessions, not because it didn't help, but because it did. Naming favoritism made it real. And once something is real, you can't keep pretending it's harmless. The therapist asked me what I wanted from my parents. I didn't have an answer. Wanting something implied hope. Hope had burned me too many times. Instead, I focused on control. I saved aggressively. I planned quietly. I built a life that didn't require permission. My parents noticed, but instead of pride, it made them uneasy. Independence threatened the narrative. If I didn't need them, they couldn't dismiss me as ungrateful. I didn't know yet that the very independence they resented would be the thing that finally tipped the balance. That the moment I stopped asking to be chosen was the moment they lost control over the story. The final incident didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in disguised as another family favor. My sister had gotten herself into trouble again, financial this time. Credit cards maxed out, rent overdue, excuses layered on top of excuses. My parents called me late one evening, their voices tight with urgency masked as concern. They needed help. Not advice. Not mediation. Money. They didn't ask outright. They never did. They framed it as temporary, as family pulling together. My sister was going through a rough patch. She'd pay it back. They'd make sure of it. I listened quietly, already knowing how this would end. When I hesitated, my mother sighed. That familiar disappointment crept in. "You're in a better position than she is," she said. "You can handle it." There it was. Responsibility disguised as obligation. I asked one question, just one. Had she asked them first? Silence answered before words did. I said no. Not gently. Not angrily. Just clearly. The reaction was immediate. My father accused me of being selfish. My mother said she didn't recognize me anymore. They reminded me of everything they'd done for me growing up, conveniently forgetting the imbalance, the sacrifices I'd made without applause. My sister texted next, pages of guilt, manipulation, and entitlement wrapped together. She called me heartless. She said family doesn't abandon each other. That word stuck with me. Abandon. Because abandonment wasn't something I'd suddenly chosen. It was something I'd survived. A week later, I found out they'd given her the money anyway, by dipping into an account I had contributed to for years. An account meant for emergencies. For everyone. They hadn't told me. They hadn't asked. They'd justified it among themselves and assumed I'd accept it later. That was the moment something hardened inside me. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them immediately. I went very still. Stillness, I'd learned, was more dangerous than anger. I reviewed statements. I documented dates. I traced patterns I'd ignored for decades. Favoritism wasn't emotional anymore, it was measurable. They thought this was just another thing I'd get over. Another boundary they could cross because I always let them. What they didn't realize was that this time, I wasn't planning to fight them. I was planning to leave. Leaving didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, in pieces. I stopped justifying my choices. Stopped responding immediately to messages designed to pull me back into chaos. I listened more than I spoke, not because I was uncertain, but because I was done wasting words on people who never heard them anyway. My parents sensed the shift before they understood it. My mother called more often, her concern sharpened by suspicion. She asked questions that weren't really questions: where I was going, who I was seeing, why I seemed distant. I answered politely, vaguely. Distance made them nervous. Control slipping always does. My sister, on the other hand, grew bolder. She demanded. She accused. She reminded me, repeatedly, of my responsibility to the family. According to her, my stability existed for her benefit. If I didn't share it, I was hoarding it. That logic had always worked before. It didn't work anymore. The final conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. All three of them sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten countless quiet meals while my sister dominated the room. My parents spoke first, rehearsed and united. They told me they were disappointed. That families support each other. That my refusal had hurt my sister deeply. I waited. I let the silence stretch until it made them uncomfortable. Then I asked something I'd never asked out loud before. When have you ever supported me at her expense? No one answered. My father cleared his throat. My mother looked away. My sister scoffed, rolling her eyes like I'd just told a bad joke. That reaction, dismissal without denial, told me everything I needed to know. They didn't disagree. They just didn't care. Something in me settled. The fight I'd carried for years finally burned out, leaving clarity behind. I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done negotiating my worth. I told them I was moving out within the month. Not far. Just enough. My mother panicked immediately, listing logistics, obstacles, concerns. My father warned me not to make rash decisions. My sister laughed and said I'd be back. That I always was. I didn't argue. I packed methodically. Documents first. Personal items next. Sentimental things last. Every box felt like reclaiming a piece of myself they'd never protected. I transferred what was mine. Closed what I could. I left nothing important unsecured. The more prepared I became, the calmer I felt. They mistook my calm for weakness. They assumed silence meant compliance. They didn't see the planning underneath it. On my final night, my mother hugged me longer than usual. She whispered that she hoped I'd come to my senses. My sister didn't bother saying goodbye. She was already convinced she'd won. I left one thing behind on purpose. A letter. I didn't write the letter in anger. I wrote it with precision. Every sentence had a purpose. Every word carried weight. This wasn't an emotional outburst, it was a record. Calm, factual, impossible to dismiss. I addressed it to all three of them. I outlined years of patterns. Specific incidents. Dates. Financial contributions. The account they'd dipped into without asking. The sacrifices I'd made under the label of being understanding. I didn't accuse. I documented. Documentation leaves no room for debate. Then I explained my decision. Not to punish. Not to manipulate. To step away. I clarified boundaries in language they couldn't twist. I would no longer provide financial support. I would no longer mediate conflicts that weren't mine. Contact would be limited, conditional, and respectful, or it wouldn't exist at all. The final section wasn't about them. It was about her. I included copies of documents my sister had never seen. Proof of whose money funded which opportunities. Clarification about ownership she'd assumed was shared. Legal realities she'd never bothered to ask about because she'd always been protected from consequences. The last line was simple. Nothing here is a threat. It's just the truth. And the truth doesn't need permission to exist. I left the letter on the kitchen table, exactly where they'd once told me to sit down and be quiet. Then I walked out. I didn't wait for reactions. I didn't watch from a distance. I turned my phone off and slept peacefully for the first time in years. The scream came the next morning. I didn't hear the scream myself. I heard about it later, from a neighbor who called to ask if everything was all right at my parents' house. According to her, it wasn't anger that filled the air, it was disbelief. The kind that cracks through denial all at once. My sister had found the letter first. She always assumed anything important belonged to her. She read it standing up. That mattered. Because when reality hit, there was nothing to hold her upright. "This can't be real," she screamed, over and over, her voice rising with every page. My parents rushed in, confused, already defensive. My mother tried to calm her, but panic leaked through her words. My father reached for the papers, scanning them quickly, his face draining of certainty. For the first time, they weren't united. My sister's world collapsed fast. The safety net she'd never seen snapped into view and disappeared at the same time. The money she believed was endless suddenly had a name attached to it, mine. The opportunities she claimed as shared were legally defined. The future she assumed was guaranteed no longer belonged to her. She accused them of lying to her. They accused me of manipulation. But the documents didn't argue back. Facts don't flinch when you yell at them. I ignored the calls at first. Let the silence do its work. When I finally turned my phone on, there were dozens of messages. My mother begged me to talk. My father demanded an explanation. My sister sent voice notes swinging wildly between rage and desperation. I responded to none of them. Days passed. Then weeks. The chaos settled into something quieter, consequences. My parents realized they couldn't force me back without leverage. My sister realized screaming didn't change paperwork. For the first time, they were stuck with the reality they'd spent decades avoiding. We met once, months later, in a public place. Neutral ground. My parents looked older. Smaller. My sister barely met my eyes. She tried one last time to rewrite the story, blaming misunderstanding, emotions, timing. I let her finish. Then I slid a copy of the letter across the table. "I already explained everything," I said calmly. "Nothing has changed." And it hadn't. I walked away without shaking, without guilt, without looking back. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared about myself more. Favoritism thrives in silence. It dies in clarity. Walking away didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like standing in unfamiliar silence after a lifetime of noise. No accusations, no demands, no reminders of who I was supposed to be for everyone else. Just quiet. And in that quiet, I realized how much of myself I'd been muting to keep the peace. Peace, I learned, isn't something you maintain by disappearing. It's something you build by choosing yourself, even when it costs you relationships you were taught to protect at all costs. For a long time, I wondered if I'd gone too far. That question crept in during late nights and slow mornings. Not because I regretted the truth, but because I'd been conditioned to feel responsible for everyone's discomfort. That conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers. It whispers doubts that sound like loyalty. But loyalty that only flows in one direction isn't loyalty at all. It's obligation dressed up as love. Distance gave me clarity. Without constant pressure, I could finally see my family for who they were, not who I kept hoping they'd become. My parents weren't villains. They were flawed, fearful people who chose the path of least resistance again and again. My sister wasn't powerful. She was protected. And protection, when unchecked, turns into entitlement that collapses the moment reality stops cooperating. I didn't feel victorious watching that collapse. I felt sad. Sad for the years lost to imbalance. Sad for the version of me who thought endurance was a virtue instead of a warning sign. Sad for the family we could have been if fairness hadn't been treated like a threat. But sadness didn't undo my decision. It confirmed it. Healing didn't come from apologies. There weren't any real ones anyway. Healing came from consistency. From waking up without anxiety. From making choices without bracing for backlash. From realizing my worth wasn't something to be negotiated at a kitchen table where I was always outnumbered. It was something inherent, something I'd had all along, even when no one reflected it back to me. The letter changed everything because it removed ambiguity. It replaced emotion with evidence. And evidence doesn't bend to denial. That's what made it so powerful. Not anger. Not revenge. Just truth, calmly presented, with nowhere to hide. For the first time, my family had to confront the imbalance they'd spent decades justifying. Whether they accepted it or not stopped being my responsibility the moment I walked out the door. I learned something important in the aftermath: you don't need closure from people who benefited from your silence. Closure is something you give yourself when you stop explaining. When you stop hoping they'll suddenly understand. When you accept that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of being free. There are days I still miss them. Not the reality, but the idea. The family I imagined when I was younger. The fairness I thought would arrive if I'd just waited long enough. Missing that doesn't make me weak. It makes me honest. Letting go of a fantasy hurts more than letting go of people who never showed up for you the way you needed. I don't tell this story to paint myself as perfect. I made mistakes. I stayed too long. I explained too much. I hoped when evidence suggested I shouldn't. But growth isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it without letting it define you. My past taught me boundaries. My future is built on them. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: favoritism survives because silence feeds it. It thrives when the overlooked child keeps adapting, keeps forgiving, keeps shrinking. The moment that child stops absorbing the imbalance, the entire structure shakes. Not because the truth is cruel, but because lies are fragile. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped carrying it alone. Life after leaving wasn't dramatic. It was steady. Predictable. Peaceful. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I surrounded myself with people who didn't need me to be smaller to feel secure. People who listened without preparing defenses. People who gave without keeping score. That's when I understood how abnormal my old normal had been. Sometimes justice isn't a courtroom or a confrontation. Sometimes it's paperwork and distance. Sometimes it's refusing to participate in dynamics that only work when you're willing to lose. The scream I never heard wasn't the victory. The silence that followed was. I don't know if my parents ever fully accepted what they did. I don't know if my sister ever stopped seeing herself as entitled to things she didn't earn. And honestly, I don't need to know. Their growth is no longer tied to mine. That separation is the greatest gift I gave myself. If you see yourself in this story, know this: you're not imagining the imbalance. You're not too sensitive. And you're not selfish for wanting fairness. You don't owe access to people who only value you when you're convenient. Walking away doesn't make you cruel. Staying and disappearing does. I didn't leave to hurt anyone. I left to stop hurting myself. And if that choice shattered an illusion they relied on, then maybe the illusion was never meant to survive the truth.